Greetings, everyone. This is Volts for February 18th, 2026. Can fake meat help solve climate change? I'm your host, David Roberts. When I recorded a pod about agriculture and climate change with author Mike Grunwald last year, we briefly touched on the outsized environmental footprint of meat production. In that conversation, I believe I expressed a degree of resignation about the meat problem. I didn't see any realistic solution, which is one reason I've never really particularly relished talking about it. Nonetheless, I have with me today someone who has made a career out of talking about it in about as energetic and comprehensive a way as you could possibly ask. His name is Bruce Friedrich. He founded and runs the Good Food Institute, a network of think tanks researching plant-based and cultivated meat. Most notably, he has a new book out called Meat: How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future. The book posits that the environmental harms of meat are real and rising, but that meat consumption is also rising and is unlikely to do anything but continue rising in the foreseeable future, and thus the only real solution is affordable meat alternatives. Friedrich argues that those alternatives are akin to renewables in their early days, in that with some sustained investment, they could be put on an S-curve of accelerated development and see rapidly declining costs. I admit that I am somewhat skeptical, but I am nonetheless delighted to have Friedrich here today to make the case, to tell me how meat alternatives will, if you'll forgive me, save our bacon. With no further ado and no further bad puns, Bruce Friedrich, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be chatting with you.
Congrats on the book, Bruce. It is amazing, comprehensive, incredibly educational. I have a lot of questions to ask. I want to mostly focus on meat alternatives. I want to get there, but to get there, we need to walk quickly through the argument that leads us there. Two parts of that argument that I want to walk through. The first part is about the environmental harms of meat, i.e. we can't just sit back and do nothing. This is bad. We've got to do something. And the second part is, but people aren't going to stop eating meat. And so the conclusion is, thus we need meat alternatives. So I want to talk about the meat alternatives, but let's just start with, this is what I want to spend the least amount of time on, but in a sense, it's the most important part. It's the reason we're doing all the rest of it, which is just the environmental impacts of meat. This is, I think, 4 chapters of your book, so it's a little crazy to ask you to boil it down, but maybe you could just give us like the 3 to 5 minute version of what meat is doing with a focus on climate. Maybe start with climate.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for asking the question. It's actually chapter 2 is the environment. So chapter 1 is hunger and malnutrition. Chapter 3 is antimicrobial resistance. Chapter 4 is pandemic risk. And chapter 2 is the environment. And I think it's oftentimes helpful to remind people of just how inefficient it is to cycle crops through animals. So according to the World Resources Institute, the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat is the chicken, and it takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. So I'm guessing most people who listen to this podcast are very concerned about food waste, and we should be concerned about food waste. For every 100 calories that are produced globally, 25 to 30 of them or so are lost. But think about the fact that if you're going to produce 100 calories of chicken, you're going to need to produce 900 calories of feed for that chicken. So you've got a sort of physiological food waste of 800 calories that are produced by our food system, but are essentially wasted raising the chicken up to slaughter weight or going into feathers, bones, blood, whatever else. So it's 9 times as much land, 9 times as much water, 9 times the herbicides and the pesticides and the fertilizers. And it's not just that. Now you're growing all of those crops and you're shipping them to a feed mill, you're operating the feed mill, you're shipping the feed to the farm, you're operating the farm, you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, you're operating the slaughterhouse. So it's multiple extra stages of gas guzzling, pollution spewing vehicles, as well as multiple energy intensive and polluting factories. Back in 2006, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, they released a more than 400-page report called Livestock's Long Shadow. And they said, whatever environmental issue you're looking at, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global, so everything from deforestation and biodiversity loss and land degradation to water use and water pollution to air pollution and to climate change, animal agriculture is one of the top three causes. For things like deforestation and biodiversity loss, it's far and away number one. Since UNFAO released that report 20 years ago, we have seen meat consumption go up globally by about 40%, from about 266 million metric tons to 370 million metric tons. And the latest numbers on climate specifically are that animal agriculture is responsible for about a fifth of climate change. And we've seen analysis. McKinsey economists did some analysis for ClimateWorks Foundation and the Global Methane Hub. The International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis did some analysis that they published in Nature Communications. And they said on both land use and climate change, the dividends that we could get from making plant-based meat and cultivated meat, and I would say these are alternative meats rather than alternatives to meat, just like your electric car is still a car or your digital camera is still a camera. This is a different way of producing meat. And the dividend is about a gigaton for every 10% protein transition, which is the equivalent of literally eliminating all airplanes at 10% alternative proteins. But eliminating all airplanes doesn't get you anything in terms of land use dividends. You also get, at 50%, 640 to 650 million hectares of land freed up, which is about the size of the entire Amazon rainforest.
Yeah. You can do some reforestation. You can throw some solar panels down there.
Exactly.
A lot of stuff you could do with that land. So meat is sort of like on the most wanted poster for virtually any environmental problem you name, very much including climate change. When I was phrasing the question, I sort of misphrased it. I know that environmental is one set of risks. The first 4 chapters are about meat's risks, let's say.
Yeah.
You touched on the environmental ones. Just briefly talk about those other 3 chapters, those other 3 big risks.
Yeah, the first one is hunger and malnutrition. And the Nobel laureate in economics for his work in this area, Michael Kremer, he put together a commission at the University of Chicago that was looking at interventions that could help with climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and food security, which they were defining food security in the hunger and malnutrition category. And they said that because of the land use needs of meat production, what ends up happening, and this is lots of peer review research about this, lots of reports from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, what ends up happening is that smallholders, pastoralists, subsistence fishing communities, they end up being thrown off their land. And the world's poorest people, because of land pressures and pressures to grow crops to feed them to chickens and pigs and other farm animals, drives up the price of cereals. And what that means is that more and more people cannot afford a nutritious diet, up to and including hunger and malnutrition. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 3 is antimicrobial resistance. About 70% of medically relevant antibiotics that the pharmaceutical industry produces every year, about 70% of them are fed to farm animals, not because those animals are sick, but because antibiotics both A, cause the animals to grow more quickly, and B, will allow the animals to be kept in conditions that would otherwise cause death losses to skyrocket. This is one of the top 2 causes of antimicrobial resistance, which the UK government has said is a more certain risk to humanity than climate change. The former head of the World Health Organization said, we're staring down the barrel of the end of modern medicine, where a lot of surgeries that we take for granted will just be not even possible if antibiotics completely stop working.
Whoa, wow.
And both of the top 2 causes, in this, including this one, are getting worse. And then chapter 4 is pandemic risk. And in July of 2020, the International Livestock Research Institute and the UN Environment Program. They released a report, 18 of the world's top zoonotic disease specialists, about 35, I think, consultants on this report, called Preventing the Next Pandemic. And they listed the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. The first one was increased meat consumption. More animals means more potential vectors for disease. The second one was the industrial raising of animals for food, both because the animals are so genetically similar and also because when you cram 50,000 chickens in a shed, that is basically a disease factory. And so the possibility of the next pandemic goes up. And in the book, I go through that. And then I also say, look, we're going in the wrong direction on all 7 of the most likely causes of the next pandemic. We just lived through COVID-19, sort of, I guess, are still to some degree on the tail end of it.
Look how well we did, Bruce. I don't know what you're so worried about. We aced it.
Well, yeah, no, I know. So nothing to worry about. But seriously, it could have been a lot more deadly. It could have been a lot more transmissible. It did send 100 million more people into dire poverty, COVID-19. And it really wasn't as bad as it could have been. The next one could be significantly worse. The bird flu in 1918 actually killed more people than World War I by a lot, about the same number of people as World War II. If you look at U.S. death losses, it killed more than World War I and World War II put together. And we have a lot more animals. We have a lot more capacity of both humans and animals to move around. The next pandemic could be pretty disastrous.
That's a lot to take in really quickly. So meat is perversely spreading hunger and malnutrition, screwing up the environment in like a dozen different ways, including climate change, making antibiotics work less well, and possibly setting the stage for the next pandemic. All those risks are bad. They're all getting worse. So I think we can sort of take it as established by the first 4 chapters of your book. Whatever we do, we can't keep doing this. Like things are bad and getting worse. We're nearing thresholds. Something's got to be done. So let me just pause here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to just pause here as like an interlude. Let's call this a vegan interlude. I personally, I'm not a vegan, not a vegetarian. I feel guilty about it, but I'm not. But I do want to have their perspective, at least, let's just speak for them briefly. So let me just say, putting on the hat of a militant vegan, I will just say, you have just made the case that meat is terrible. Terrible for the environment, terrible for society, terrible for land, terrible for our health, possibly our respiratory health, our heart health, whatever. So that's one fact. And then the second fact is we know that human beings can thrive without meat. Millions of people do it. In the vast, vast majority of cases, there might be some edge cases, but in the vast, vast majority of cases, we know that it's possible to live a perfectly good, healthy life without meat. And so those are the only 2 facts we need. It's a monstrosity. It's awful. It's destroying land and people and society. It's a bad thing. And we could stop without harm, really, which is unusual. Like there's a lot of instances where we're using fossil fuels where we really don't have alternatives, where we can't just stop without quite a bit of harm. This is a place where we could stop basically harmlessly. So basically what we're doing is a monstrous, historic, moral crime with our eyes wide open. And all the discourse about it is mostly an effort to avoid just looking that basic fact in the face. Now, I think you and I would probably agree that that is not a particularly useful perspective. You and I probably agree that if you're trying to change public opinion, that's probably not the best approach. You probably don't want to go out starting by accusing people of being horrendous moral criminals. But just between us, in our heart of hearts, it's true, isn't it?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there's a difference between a heart of heart way of looking at something and a utilitarian way of looking at something. The vast majority of people are good people who are trying to make the world better. Everybody is the hero of their own story, obviously. And I think there is just something physiological about the way that human beings are programmed, such that It's just true that as economies develop and the population grows, meat consumption goes up. So, literally every year since FAO started measuring, and I'm sure every year before that as well, meat consumption has gone up and up and up. And all of the predictions are that that is going to continue as long as the global economy gets larger and as long as global population grows. We're going to see both per capita meat consumption go up with the economy getting larger, and obviously more people mean more per capita meat. So the lowest predictions for 2050 are another 50% more meat than we have now. If that happens, according to the World Resources Institute in a report that they put together with the World Bank and the UNEP and the UNDP, we're not going to have any forests left. We're not going to have any savannas left. And we are going to absolutely blow through even backup climate targets. And the only two things that anybody is thinking about that might change that are one, let's lean in on convincing the world to eat less meat, which we've been doing for at least 55 years. Diet for a Small Planet came out in 1971, and it makes the environmental and the global hunger argument, I think, extremely well. So 55 years ago, 1971, and meat consumption just goes up and up and up. I do think at this point, if somebody is not changing their diets, it's not due to lack of information. It's due to the fact that it's really, really hard to change diets, and vegetarians and vegans get incensed when you say that. And they're like, no, I did it.
They really do. Although I've never been able to do it myself. Like I go back and forth on this. Like, I've tried at points in my life to go without meat, and it really does. Like, I feel it physiologically. I feel unsatisfied perpetually. And that lasted for weeks or months when I tried. But then on the other hand, I have the vegetarian on my other shoulder being like, give me a break.
Some people change. A lot of people change. Most of the people who have started plant-based meat and cultivated meat companies have changed. I've personally changed. I've been a vegan for 38 years. But what I've learned in 38 years of veganism is that most people aren't going to do it. And in the book, I make the point, I basically say, look, I think this is systems one thinking. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate in economics, his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. There is just something ingrained in the vast majority of people that the fat in meat, the umami in meat, for most of humanity, we have not known where our next meal is going to come from. And consequently, we crave highly calorically dense foods. It's no longer to our benefit, but we deny it at our peril if what we're trying to do is make a difference on the meat problem. And this is very much like what the energy community has recognized to be true about energy consumption. The world has consumed more energy every single year since forever, other than a blip for COVID. Other than those kinds of shocks, we're just not going to convince, it is just not a reasonable strategy to try to convince the entire world to consume less energy and walk more. We need renewable energy as one tool in the toolkit. And that doesn't mean that you get rid of other tools, but it does mean that renewable energy is essential. It does mean that electrification of transport is essential. And what appears to be true, unless somebody's got some new strategy that they're holding in abeyance to spring on us at some point, despite overwhelming success in focusing attention on the environmental and global health and other animal protection consequences of meat consumption, people eat more and more meat. So let's add a tool to our toolbox. Let's learn from what renewable energy and electrification of transport have done, and let's give consumers what they love about meat. It's delicious, it's affordable, principally, and let's use science to biomimic the precise meat experience using plants, and let's use science to grow actual animal meat, but doing it in cultivators that look like fermenters for beer instead of on live animals. And we can slash the adverse consequence. We can eliminate the contribution to antimicrobial resistance and pandemic risk. And we can slash the contribution to hunger, malnutrition, and a range of environmental harms.
It would be fair to say you have no problem with other people out there trying to convince other people to stop eating meat. You have no problem with stopping eating meat. You have stopped eating meat. You just think, from a purely pragmatic point of view, the quest to persuade any substantial portion of humanity to go along with that is probably futile, and thus this is kind of the only remainder. It's the only other way to go.
Well, I mean, I think it's the only other way to go. And it's also the case that if you look at land-based and food-based climate solutions, this appears to be the only one that can spread in the same way that renewable energy and electric vehicles can spread, which is to say it's market-based and it's science-based. So you look at the history of solar, and you really do. You have, Germany, the US, Japan, and China responsible for the massive downward trajectory in prices and consequently the massive upward trajectory, the S curve, we're on it now, trajectory for decarbonization of electricity. That's basically what happened with electric vehicles. We can do that with plant-based and cultivated meat. It doesn't appear likely that we can do that with anything else. So again, McKinsey economists for Climate Works Foundation and the Global Methane Hub, they looked at all of the agricultural methane interventions. So they looked at interventions for food loss and waste.
Landfill,
Yep.
capture, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the principal ones they looked at rice mitigation, they looked at food loss and waste, they looked at things like methane inhibitors and other cattle-based methane reduction interventions, and they looked at alternative proteins. And they found that of the economic benefits of these technologies, 98% went to alternative proteins, because this is something just like renewable energy. Once you get to the point at which markets can take over without subsidies, then it just becomes perpetual. The rights law decrease in prices based on increase in adoption just keeps going. It'll stop at some point.
Well, will it? I'm going to return to that analogy.
Okay.
I'm going to turn to that analogy soon. Okay, so we've established meat's a big problem, big environmental problem, health problem, etc. Number one. And number two, it's unlikely people are going to stop eating meat. Meat consumption has gone up every year since we started recording it. It's probably going to keep going up. Ergo, the only way out of this dilemma is through alternative meats. So let's talk about alternative meats. It seems to me, like I'm not far from an expert on any of this, but it seems to me like plant-based meats and cultivated meats are very, very different things, very different industries, but you sort of lump them together. You talk about alternative meats throughout the book as kind of a unit. So I'd just like to hear you talk about that a little bit. Like why do you think it makes sense to lump those together?
I mean, your intuition, I think, aligns to the intuition of a lot of people. If we were talking about wind energy and solar energy, you might say, they're radically different ways to produce energy. The thing that unites them is that they allow you to decarbonize energy production. With plant-based meat and cultivated meat, it's definitely the case that we start at kind of negative 100 on plant-based meat. We have to first explain to people that no, our goal is not to convince you to pay more for products that you like less, which has kind of been this has basically been what plant-based meat has been for a really long time. I mean, veggie burgers have been veggie first, and burger really not at all.
Form factor wise, you could say
exactly
that's about it.
But nobody was trying to make them taste the same. Nobody was trying to make them cost competitive. If you've got a $600 million industry marketing to flexitarians and reducitarians and people who wanted to eat less meat, that's still a significant industry in the United States. And 10 years ago, there was no Impossible Burger. 10 years ago, there was no Beyond Burger. They both launched, the Beyond Burger launched in May of 2016, the Impossible Burger a few months after that. And up until that point, there really was not the idea that we might biomimic the precise meat experience using plants. And then Ethan Brown and Pat Brown came along, no relation, founded Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. And the basic brainstorm was science can do this. We can make plant fats and proteins behave like animal fats and proteins. We can mimic the umami flavor. And for the same reason that these are a massive environmental boon, they require far fewer resources. At scale, they will also cost less. And one of the reasons that we insist on saying alternative meats rather than meat alternatives is to really underline the fact that we are not going for something that people have to sacrifice at all to consume. We're going for something that nails the experience. No innovation comes out fully formed. If you look at something like the automobile from 1900 to 1910, 500 automobile companies failed, including Henry Ford's first automobile company. In 1908, he introduced the Model T. It was the first car that average people could operate. Up until 1908, automobiles were really hard to operate. You had to be very strong to turn the crankshaft. You had to be basically a mechanic because they were breaking down all the time, and they were really expensive. And Woodrow Wilson said, he was president of Princeton at the time, he said, automobiles will never be more than a plaything for the idle rich. Flash forward 100 years, and you've got interstate commerce. And the NASDAQ loses during the dot-com bubble 80% of its value. Pets.com goes out of business. Amazon drops 97% its stock value from $213 to less than $6. And the commentary was ruthless. Who would ever want to buy pet supplies online? Who are you kidding? When is this Jeff Bezos character ever going to turn a profit? This is all snake oil. But we got landlines. You no longer had to dial up. People got used to ordering things online. We gave people what they like about buying things, confidence that the things were going to be, high quality, et cetera. You don't have to go to a mall. And now Chewy is worth $13 billion market cap, 30 times what Pets.com was ever valued at. The plant-based meat products are not good enough yet, and they cost too much. And if you look at the obituaries for plant-based meat, in the media, those are the two things that are cited for why they have failed. Well, yes, nobody ever said these are going to be fantastically successful while they cost too much and don't taste good enough, because consumers want the meat experience. But what is it about the science that makes anybody think that they can't biomimic the meat experience? Maybe they can't. Nobody's done it yet, but we haven't tried very hard, and we don't have a plan B.
I was talking to a guy who does virtual power plants. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's just like a bunch of distributed energy devices coordinated to act as a single entity. Part of what he's trying to do is reach a point where that looks to a grid operator exactly like a power plant, that it can pass something akin to a Turing test. You know what the Turing test is. So like, can a virtual power plant fool the grid into thinking it's a real power plant? Can it effectively act identically to a power plant? And I've sort of was waiting for you to introduce something similar in this part of your book. Like, it seems like this is what you're describing. The goal here is a plant-based or cultivated burger that in a blind taste test could not be distinguished from meat. Is that kind of the holy grail here? That's what you're after? And there's no name for that test. You should be claiming this IP, Bruce. This should be the Friedrich test.
That's funny. Yeah, no, I like it. The sort of thing that we say in the book, and really what that I say in the book, and what everybody at GFI, like our fundamental focus, is get the products to a place where they taste the same or better and cost the same or less. And they have to be nutritionally superior as well. But as I talk about in the book, that's baked in for both plant-based meat and cultivated meat. That's not something that we need to solve. But we do need to solve taste parity on the plant-based side, and we need to solve cost parity on both sides. And that's really our focus. And we think you do that by building a maximally robust scientific and engineering ecosystem. And the way we think you do that is government support. So really the sort of clarion call of the book is that governments should be supporting the science of plant-based and cultivated meat, and they should be supporting infrastructure and manufacturing build out. And obviously the reasons that they would do that are the same reasons that they would do that for renewable energy or electric vehicles. Probably not going to be environmentalism.
Yeah, we'll return to this question too. I want to start by looking at the extant markets as they exist today. So I read that investment in alternative proteins dropped by almost 50% in 2025. So I think the popular, I remember, just sort of as a member of the public, I sort of remember veggie burgers kind of having their moment, and then they kind of faded, and then Impossible came along and popped up in Burger King and kind of a thing, and then that kind of faded. And then my impression now is that they're basically the hype cycle is in a trough, that investment is low, and that public faith that this is ever going to get where it needs to go is low. And that's on the plant-based side, which has actually had some time. The cultivated side, as far as I can tell, is not an industry yet. They're not actually selling any products yet. Is that a fair description on both sides?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty close to fair. We're definitely in the trough of disillusionment on the plant-based side. The products are not yet competing on price or taste. Some of them, a very small number, are pretty close on taste, but none of them are anywhere near where they need to be on price. And then on the cultivated meat side, there are a very limited number of restaurants on the planet where you can get cultivated meat. So yes, there is not a meaningful market by any stretch of the imagination. I will say that the sort of rebuttal to that is that year after year after year after year, the amount of government support goes up every single year. The number of papers published goes up every single year. The number of scientists focused on this goes up every single year. The number of conferences goes up every single year. So it's struggling on the private sector side, but because of the economic gains that are to be made here, as well as food self-sufficiency and food security arguments, governments are funding science in this space. It's early days, as you and Mike Grunwald were talking about. We have a lot of science and engineering and scale up left to do, but it is moving in the right direction, but despite some headwinds on the private sector side.
Well, let me ask about this. So the premise here is that with sufficient science and investment, this will get on a cost curve. Volts listeners are very familiar with cost curves. You double deployment and costs go down by some percentage. It is held reliably true for a number of technologies, a number of clean energy technologies. But it is not the case that all technologies get on learning curves. We've done a lot of episodes on this, which ones do and don't. And it's not obvious to me that something that is kind of at root biological is going to mimic technology in terms of getting on that curve. At the very least, that seems like a rather large assumption, isn't it? That perfecting a biological process is gonna get on that same curve that tech processes do. Like, why should we assume that that's true?
Yeah, I mean, I dive into that in chapter 9. So I talk about Wright's law and learning curves. I talk about how that has worked for EV batteries and actually cars and airplanes and solar and wind and
refrigerators, name it.
Yes, which are things that have to be produced. And I make the case both A, we are seeing that on the cultivated meat side. The first cultivated burger cost 250,000 euros. It's down a decade later by a factor of 100,000. So it's down by 99.999%.
I can't do that math in my head, Bruce. What's the
$3 a burger.
$3 a burger
to produce. So it's still twice as expensive as producing beef.
Mm-hmm.
And that's at a pretty small scale. What's it going to look like to produce it at mass scale? There are going to be some engineering challenges to that. But media costs, there was a techno-economic analysis done where the author said media costs cannot get below $6.50. They're now below 50 cents. So in his argument that this wasn't going to be possible. And it really does remind me of just a decade ago, the number of people who continued to be in denial about whether solar costs could continue to come down, EV battery costs could continue to come down. We are innovating on both the plant-based meat side and the cultivated meat side. And here is a case where your previous observation, the science of both of these is pretty radically different. And so it may be that what the cost curves on one of these can come down and down and down, and the cost curve, cost curves will work for one and not work for the other. But for the book, I chatted with 30 plant-based meat scientists, 30 cultivated meat scientists. They all are very enthusiastic about the idea that the cost curves concept and S-curve growth, once we hit price and taste parity, is going to work. And they point toward it. I talk about this in the book. They point toward what is kind of an intuitive observation. If something requires a fraction of the resources of something else, and if something requires far fewer stages of production, so for chicken, you have a ninth the inputs for plant-based chicken, a third the inputs for cultivated chicken. Both of those are even pilot plant numbers. They're likely to get even better for the alternative meats. And instead of having to grow the crops, ship the crops, you don't have the feed mill, you don't have the farm. You basically sub the slaughterhouse for the plant-based meat or the cultivated meat factory. and you have far fewer stages of production, far fewer resources required, it's going to take time to ramp up, the oil production. It's going to take time to ramp up the protein production. For cultivated meat, it's going to take time to ramp up both the production infrastructure as well as the media to feed the small samplings of animal fat or animal muscle. But it's hard to imagine that at production scales, these will not be less expensive and significantly less expensive. And then you've just got, can science biomimic the precise meat experience using plants? Can science produce meat at 200,000 liters and cause the animal fat and muscle to grow at that size? It's never been done before, but nobody, like I haven't talked to anybody who thinks, no, there's some scientific reality that makes the physics of this impossible.
Yeah, there is a manufacturing insight, I think, that says basically like with sufficient scale, costs of production converge over time on the costs of materials, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And so many fewer and much cheaper materials going into this process.
Not yet, but it's the science indicates that should be possible. And in all of human history, we put about $3 billion into cultivated meat. And, a journalist wrote, $3 billion have been poured into this. Where's my cultivated burger? And it's like, that's less than the cost of one EV battery factory. That's about the cost. If you've already got a massive biopharma company, that's about the cost to bring 2 drugs to market. And it's been spread across 150 companies in 10 years. It's just not that much effort. And that's one of the reasons that in chapters 1 through 4, I'm saying, like, the stakes on this, unless you have some, no pun intended, alternative plan for solving antimicrobial resistance, for solving hunger and malnutrition, and for solving the range of environmental harms that come with conventional meat production, this is the sort of thing that we should muster the resources to try to make it work. And hey, the science looks pretty good.
I want to ask you a science question because one of the things I found really interesting is like the vibe I get from later chapters is that you kind of think that it might not be possible to get there with plant-based. It seems like in the long term, you have more hope for cultivated meat. And remember, like when we talk about get there, we're talking about getting to a place where, like if I sit down with a plant-based burger, I basically can't tell the difference, right? You, it seems like, are somewhat skeptical that plant-based is ever going to get there. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, it's accurate, but I should add the caveat that I am not convinced that the science is harder. I am convinced that the science is less intuitive. And so in the book, I look at things that there are an awful lot of inventions, as Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talk about in Abundance. There are a lot of inventions that are waiting to be invented. And you can fail at something because the science doesn't work, and you can fail at it because you didn't bring the will. And I think a lot of people's intuition on plant-based meat is that it's not possible. That intuition is backed by what looks like a lot of effort that hasn't been successful. In the book, what I say is, look, most of this effort hasn't even tried. All of these companies that came along and said, we're the next Impossible Foods, and they said, we're going to have a product in 6 months. We don't have a science team. Impossible Foods, Pat Brown is one of the greatest scientists currently living, an incredibly impressive human being. Took him tens of millions of dollars in 5 years to create the Impossible Burger. And these first-time entrepreneurs, fresh out of business school, and they come along and they're basically going to squish some ingredients together and call it an Impossible Burger. They raise a lot of money to do precisely that. They fail, and people go, oh, the plant-based meat endeavor failed. When what happened was they didn't try. They were intentionally the next Garden Burger, saying they're the next Impossible.
This gets to, I think, a larger macro problem with scientific innovation generally, especially in capitalist cultures, which is that the amount of sustained attention and investment you need over time to get plant-based to where it needs to go doesn't seem like something a single company can do while also making money.
Yeah.
In the interim, it seems like the kind of thing where you need government. You need some public subsidy if you want that sustained research program.
I think you probably need that on the cultivated meat side too, but at least the cultivated meat entrepreneurs and innovators are focused on the right target.
So you don't think the plant-based meat industry has sufficiently taken your goal upon itself? Like you don't think that they are shooting for the right target?
No, and I make that point pretty explicitly in the book and give a whole bunch of examples. But one of the things that's really interesting is if you go to a conference on cultivated meat, and the first one was just a little over 10 years ago, and now there are dozens every single year. And you go to these conferences, and there are a lot of innovators who are focused on B2B. So there are basically four things you need to solve on cultivated meat, and there are startups doing all four of those things. And I think the point that you just made is a really good one. It's really hard to have an R&D company. It's also really hard to have a company that makes products for people to buy. You multiply those two incredible difficulties, and that's what all of the plant-based meat companies are right now. Not quite all, but just about all of them. And on the cultivated meat side, it is probably harder science, but everybody understands the assignment, and that is what they're focused on. And it's really hard to get mixed up on the cultivated meat side, whereas most of what's happening on the plant-based side is noise. And the other thing that I hadn't thought of until Aaron Reese Clayton, one of our scientists, pointed out to me, is that every single human being on the planet who is currently working in tissue engineering has the basic skill set that's necessary to understand what needs to happen for cultivated meat to be successful. Nobody has ever been challenged to figure out how to mimic the umami flavor of meat. Nobody's ever been challenged to figure out how to get plant fats or proteins to behave like animal fats or proteins.
But I thought that's what Beyond was trying to do.
Yes, those two companies, and there are a handful more now. But my point is that the people doing that do not come in with the scientific sort of expertise necessary to figure out how you solve plant-based meat. Nobody has ever, like every tissue engineer, literally, I don't know how many tissue engineers there are, but many thousands of them working in human therapeutics, they all have the requisite skill set for cultivated meat. The only application for trying to convince plant fats, proteins, and flavors to behave like animal fats, proteins, and flavors is that. So the only people doing it are doing that. And so it's, literally probably dozens of people, maybe we're past 100 now, but thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and they all come in with the right skill set. So you look at the two people who were the fathers of cultivated meat. They're both medical doctors, and one of them, he's also a PhD in tissue engineering, Mark Post, the person who made that 250,000 euro burger with money from Sergey Brin back in 2013. The other one is Uma Valeti, the founder and CEO of Upside Foods, then Memphis Meats, and he was the president of the Twin Cities, both the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association. He trained at Mayo in tissue engineering as a medical doctor. Tufts is kind of one of the centers, maybe the center in the United States, Tufts and NC State and UC Davis. And at Tufts, it's David Kaplan, who was the chair of the biomedical engineering department at Tufts, who's leading the efforts on cultivated meat at that university. And they come in with the right skill set. You need a lot of different people with a lot of different skill sets. And the overall scientific challenge may be easier, but we don't have massive numbers of scientists who have the right skill set. Everybody has to be retrained on the plant-based meat side. So I do think I talk to a lot of people. Everybody thinks the science can work, but it could be that the practical challenges end up being insurmountable. My hope is that we'll be able to create the enthusiasm and the focus and the support to make both technologies work. But if I were to predict one will work and one will not, it would be cultivated that works.
Yeah, this gets a little bit back to your renewables analogy. Was one thing I wanted to ask about. It was like one way that the countries you cited earlier stimulated research and activity in renewable energy was it wasn't all carrots. There were sticks involved, right? It wasn't just governments subsidizing research. It was also restrictions on fossil-based energy that created some of that will. Most of what you discuss in the book is carrots. I wonder if you don't think that maybe one of the things that would create more activity on the plant-based side is just some sticks, something to force that urgency, some kind of penalties on meat. Do you think that's just impossible? Like, why?
I mean, the main thing I think is that we can convince governments that is in their interest. So, the foreword to my book, the number one person who I wanted to write the foreword to the book is Caitlin Welsh. She was at the State Department and then the National Security Council. She was Obama's second term, almost all of Trump's first term at the National Security Council. She's now director of Global Food and Water Security for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And she spearheaded a report that CSIS did about alternative proteins, talking about the food security, food self-sufficiency, and economic competitiveness arguments for alternative proteins. And they end up saying that the US government should lean in on alternative proteins in the same way that it has leaned in on things like advanced chips for AI and biopharma.
So you think this is part of that, because there's a sort of general, I would say, global pullback from the kind of rah-rah global trade attitude of the 90s and 2000s. Sort of legendarily, there's been kind of a pullback away from globalization. You think this is part of that story?
I think it's a response to that story.
The fact that we rely on trade to feed ourselves is increasingly being viewed as a liability, as a weakness.
I mean, it's always been viewed as a liability and a weakness. That's coming into even more stark relief now. Countries have always wanted to be food self-sufficient, but certainly the global dynamic that you're describing right now accurately puts into stark relief just how risky it can be to not be food self-sufficient. And that's one of the reasons that we're seeing, the earliest leaders on alternative proteins were Israel and Singapore, because they're tiny and they don't produce that much food.
Well, right, but we do. Like, we have giant ranchers and a S-load of land. So why wouldn't food security for us, especially if you're talking about the U.S. federal government, which is, shall we say, heavily influenced by big ag, why wouldn't the response to food security be like, well, let's just grow more and raise more meat in the United States? Like, why does that necessarily militate for alternatives?
I mean, it doesn't necessarily militate for alternatives, but the thing two things that CSIS say that's responsive to that. One is that no matter what we think about the fact that we live in a global economic and agricultural marketplace, we do. And when we retrenched or pulled back on things like renewable energy and electric vehicles, what we basically did is said, hey, China, you can dominate these industries. Do we want to do that with agriculture and meat production is thing one. And then thing two is even in the United States, all of those extra stages of production add fragility and vulnerability to the way that we produce food. And it really is an incredibly precarious food system that is really quite fragile. And if we can tighten it up, that will also increase the US's food security. And then the other thing they say is this is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, and the US should play for it, especially in seafood. We're something like 2% or something of global seafood, which is a $500 billion market. Right now, we have the two global leaders on plant-based meat. We have 3 of the 5 or 6 global leaders on cultivated meat, but we could lose that pretty quick.
So it's nascent, but we are currently in the lead, you would say, the United States?
I mean, we're in the lead for startups and innovation, and we certainly have the capacity to be in the lead for overall science. But no, China has taken over the lead. If you look at patents in cultivated meat, the 20 most active patent holders, patent applicants, 8 of them are Chinese. 3 of them are from the US, 3 from Korea, 3 from Israel. So we definitely are winning on innovation and startups, where there's, Israel is second, but we're way out in front. And we're winning on number of scientists and scientific innovation, maybe we're tied with China, but they came into it late and they've already lapped us.
Well, that's just what we did with renewables, Bruce. Like, we had the IP, we had the research, we had the science, we had the innovations, and then we just handed it to China to do the manufacturing and the scale. Like, it would be hilarious, darkly hilarious, if we just did the exact same thing all over again on this industry. Which leads me to the question, how does big ag feel about this? Like, I mean, one of the reasons I'm a little skeptical about the analogy with renewable energy is that, like, at the very least, there's like some public excitement about renewable energy. There's a lot of money being made, but in the US, insofar as this comes up, it seems like people are against it. It seems like there's a lot of people against it. They're like suing to prevent these people from using the word meat. Like Oklahoma or one of those states out there is doing some ridiculous thing where you can only call it meat if it's raised in a field or something. Like, it seems like there's backlash, not support from the meat industry. So what is the disposition of big ag toward this?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the interesting places where big ag needs to be disaggregated because the largest meat companies are enthusiastic. Tyson Foods, JBS, Cargill, and then their representative in Washington, the Meat Institute, they're not taking a yes, let's go all in on this stance, but they are investing and they are basically supportive.
Interesting. And cultivated or plant-based or both?
In both.
Huh.
And this is one where I think there's an advantage to alternative meats relative to energy because the meat industry, they don't own the farms. They mostly don't own the slaughterhouses. If they can lose some of the fragility and go with larger profit margins, that's pretty appealing. And I have heard people in the meat industry say, we don't want to be Kodak. We want to be Canon. But what you just described is also real. There are mostly ranching interests that are pushing back. And as you will have seen in the book in chapter 10, what I try to say is right now, it's really hard to be a farmer. It's really hard to be a rancher. And alternative meats are responsible for none of that because we're basically don't exist as an industry. What would it look like to shift away from the get big or get out thing that has made it so hard to be a rancher or a farmer? And we have done some economic modelings that look at things like as you shift to alternative proteins, it frees up so much land that, for example, Green Alliance, a climate and environment think tank in the UK, they looked at 10 European countries and they said, so this is how much land's freed up. If you take a third of that and devote it to human food, you can get to food self-sufficiency for 8 of the countries and net food self-sufficiency for the 10 countries put together. You take a third of it and you rewild and move to tree planting, and you can sequester so much carbon on that rewilded land that you get about 250 million metric tons of sequestration. And then you take a third of that land and you shift to regenerative/agro-ecological practices, legitimately regenerative and agro-ecological practices, not the sort of greenwash version. And you can 4x the amount of land for regenerative ranching and regenerative farming. And it feels like working with farmers and ranchers on all 3 of those. Let's shift to higher value products for human consumption. Let's pay farmers and ranchers to rewild and rehabilitate land. And for the meat that farmers and ranchers are going to be raising, let's make those animal products, the meat, dairy, and eggs, let's do that in a more regenerative and agroecologically sustainable way. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do in the book.
I mean, that makes total sense to me, a fruity coastal liberal, but how do the ranchers? I mean, this is something we learned about kind of the coal industry, right? Like, you can go to a coal worker and say, "Look, we'll just pay you to retire, and you're fine. You'll have all the money you need. We'll pay for your health care." And a lot of them will just say, "No, screw you. There's more to this than the money. There's more to this than." Do you know what I mean? There's, I would say, an irrational or maybe to irrational cultural attachment to these things that goes beyond mere money and inputs and outputs and profits. Do you know what I mean? Like, I wonder how deep the attachment, not just, the attachment specifically to raising animals on land goes, how deep that attachment goes and how rational it is and how rational they are in responding to these incentives.
I mean, it's certainly the case. There are not many chicken or pig farmers who are raising animals in anything other than industrial systems. So we really are just talking about dairy farmers and ranchers. And obviously, there are as many different views of kind of everything as there are dairy farmers and ranchers. But we have seen real interest in having these conversations. And I think there is a distrust, sort of a distrust of Washington, a distrust of policies and regulations that comes just sort of inherently with the ethos of being a rancher. But I don't think that most people who are ranchers or dairy farmers, like, I don't think that they would feel, I mean, like, who knows better the ecology of the prairies of the West than the ranchers? And if we can legitimately get to a place where we are paying them to rewild part of their land and they're able to raise animals in a more agroecologically sustainable way. I mean, you see these documentaries, and a lot of these ranchers, I mean, especially the documentaries like Kiss the Ground and those sorts of documentaries, like the ranchers are legitimately really, really enthusiastic about care for the animals and care for the land. And in a lot of these documentaries, they really hate the day when they have to take the animals to slaughter, which is pretty fascinating. And then you combine those observations with the fact that 98% of beef cattle in the United States spend the last half of their lives on feedlots. That is a horrible existence in addition to being environmentally catastrophic. If we could shift to a world where all of the beef that was produced came from animals that didn't see a feedlot and that actually had the opportunity to graze and restore lands in a truly holistic management system, that feels like the kind of thing that ranchers could get behind, but it would require more land. And where are you going to find that land? Our hypothesis is that alternative proteins is how you free up the land to allow that to happen. Because again, the World Resources Institute, the report that they did with the World Bank, UNEP, UNDP, they said on our current trajectory, we're going to need 3 billion hectares of additional land or serious gains in crop productivity. And those have largely leveled off. That literally means no more forests, no more prairies, no more savannas. And that doesn't make the kind of ranching that could be sustainable, just doesn't make it possible.
You said there are 4 areas where cultivated meat needs work. We've been kind of dancing around, but I would like to hear a little bit about the science of cultivated meat. And maybe, like, I'm not even sure people even know what this means, but the idea is you are using biofermentation to grow tissue in a vat, basically. Like that's what we're talking about here. So let's run through those 4 areas just to give us a sense of, like, what are these scientists doing? What are they trying to figure out?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, I think a really good way to intuitively think about it is just like you can take a seed or a cutting from a plant, bathe the seed or the cutting in nutrients, and grow a whole plant. You can take a small amount of fat or muscle from an animal, a sesame seed sized amount of fat or muscle, and grow basically unlimited additional fat and muscle. And you're doing it, as you said, you can call it in tanks, but it basically looks like a brewery. So you have the fermenters for beer. We call them cultivators for meat. And you basically end up with, your friendly neighborhood meat brewery, essentially.
And just to be clear, what comes out on the back end of this process is flesh. I don't even know if we have a vocabulary for it, but like on a molecular level, it is meat. Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, Leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. On a molecular level, it is meat.
Yeah, I mean, just like you can use a seed or a cutting to grow a plant, and it's still a plant. And just like for human medicine, you can grow an ear, and it's still an ear. The thing that makes this so much easier is it doesn't have to be attached to a body and continue to live another number of decades or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, so I mean, just like you might have a variety of seeds, you're going to have a variety of different samples of animal muscle or animal flesh. Figuring out how to develop those so that they can grow effectively is one of the critical technology elements. And then just like if you're going to have, if you're going to have like a greenhouse, you're going to have the sort of structures that the plants grow on. In the case of meat, it's a scaffold. And so that's how you can grow whole cut animal meat. And then if you've got a greenhouse, you're going to have, fertilizer and light and the other things that go into causing the plants to grow. Here you have what's called media, and that's the aminos and the carbohydrates and the other elements that cause the animal meat to grow. And then finally, you have the cultivators, the massive tanks. And we have a lot of innovation to do across all of those, although the one that we have made the least progress on is that last one. Although there's an Australian company called Vow, their chief technology officer came to them from SpaceX, and they have done some really remarkable things. It was really assumed that the cheapest way to grow meat in cultivators was going to be to repurpose basically bioreactors from biopharma. And what Vow discovered is that they can get to a fourth at this point. And it's very, very early on, lots of innovation still to do. They can strip the bells and the whistles, the things that you don't need if what you're doing is growing meat for food, as opposed to what you'd be doing it for therapeutics. They can get to a fourth the cost of even a reconstituted secondhand bioreactor from industry, which is pretty interesting. But we still have a long way to go to be producing at 200,000 liters. Just a lot of innovation to do.
So I'm guessing when you talk about innovation, you talk about figuring out how to make things grow faster, figuring out how to target maybe like textures and tastes. Are we to that granularity yet where like you can set out to design a particular texture?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And lots of companies. I mean, nobody's I guess, in Israel they've done sort of what they're calling a micro steak. But chicken, pork, beef, salmon, there are a lot of people producing a lot of meat. And just to take a step back, I mean, one thing is this is bipartisan. There were 10 Republican members of Congress who, on the back of a report out of China about cultivated meat, wrote to the Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence saying, hey, China is doing this. What are we doing to make sure that we are competing? And really all over the world, the idea of leaning in on economic competitiveness, the idea of wanting to be food self-sufficient is bipartisan. And so it does seem like the sort of thing, and government support is going up every single year. A number of scientists are going up every single year. Literally 10 years ago right now, there were 4 scientific papers on cultivated meat that had ever been written. Now we're producing more than 160 per year. There were 7 cultivated meat patents in all of time. Now there are more than 1,000. So a lot of things are going in the right direction.
I think this is a question that comes up for a lot of people, like project out maybe 5 years of some intensive scientific work, research, innovation, and the cultivated meat people can replicate the taste and texture of, I don't know, ground beef or chicken.
They're doing that now. A lot of companies are doing that now.
They're getting where they can mimic extant meats. What I wonder is, a big enough, wealthy enough industry, are we going to start seeing sort of bespoke meats, novel meats, like meats with new tastes and new textures that we have not yet encountered in the wild? Do you think that is going to be a thing?
Well, I mean, 2 things. One is there are probably 100 companies now. It's pretty easy at this point because costs have come down so far. So 10 years ago, if you wanted, half a chicken nugget, it was going to be thousands of dollars. That's literally the first thing that I consumed, as I talk about in the book. And now that's, probably tens of dollars. I talk in the book about 200 people at the TED Countdown conference being fed cultivated chicken. So 9 years after it was, thousands of dollars for half a chicken nugget, 200 people were dining on cultivated meat. So it's relatively inexpensive to do now because costs have come down so astronomically. And there's certainly dozens of companies who are right now producing things that are indistinguishable from ground chicken, beef, and pork.
When you say indistinguishable, do you really, really mean indistinguishable? Like, have there been blind taste tests? Have there been, you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
do you mean not close, not an approximation, but genuinely indistinguishable?
I mean, I think Mike said on your podcast what has been the experience of a lot of people, which is that it's better because so much, factory farm chicken flesh now is, tougher, not really very
Yeah.
good. But yes, it is being served regularly to people, and they say that it competes with the best animal meat that they have consumed.
I didn't know we were that far along.
I mean, it's still way too expensive. And the reality, the polling is very, very clear. People aren't going to pay more for it. But the science is there. It's still twice as expensive as beef, which means it's, 5 times as expensive as chicken to produce. And it's going to take some time to get there. And then figuring out how we scale it up is going to be tough. But the scientific progress on the basis of literally 10 years ago right now, there were 4 science papers ever published. There was one company that had raised a dime, Upside Foods. We made a lot of progress in what is, relatively speaking, a finger snap. And, like with people in energy transition, I point out the EV1 launched in 1996, right? If we had said 10 years later, well, let's leave EVs for dead, that would have been 2006. And there was like no EV industry whatsoever.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you start with the launch, Tesla's incorporated in 2003 and 2013, there are basically no EVs in 2013. We have come a really long way in 10 years. And further to your question from just about a minute ago, the Australian company that I mentioned that's doing the remarkable work on bioreactors at 20,000 liters, they are actually producing something that's sort of a cross between duck and foie gras, but it is not duck and it is not foie gras, and they are selling it in Singapore and about to sell it in Australia and New Zealand. So we're already at the place where there is at least one company that is thinking outside the sort of box of the current species.
This gets to a whole array of topics that we could talk for a whole nother hour on, which is just about the human behavioral parts of all this. This is what's fascinating to me. Like, if you come up with a novel meat that's not duck and not foie gras, but some combination, I can imagine, like, if you're a rich person in Singapore, that being attractive to you.
Sure.
Like, ooh, a novel, like a novel luxury thing. But I can also imagine a yuck reaction. I mean, I don't think I have to imagine it. I think a lot of people just have a yuck reaction. I think that is a very common sentiment out there in the world. I'm not eating meat you grew in a lab. I think a lot of people just have like immediate reaction to it. I just wonder, like, how deep and enduring do you think that instinct is? Do you think that's something that people are just gonna naturally get over with not that much issue, or do you worry about that gut reaction?
I think that is a very natural human reaction to new foods, because for the longest time, you figured out whether something was going to kill you by eating it and seeing what happened or make you sick. And so new foods were programmed to have worries about. But the worst polling on cultivated meat still finds more than 20%. If you call it lab grown meat, if you include a really unattractive photo of it, the worst polling is still more than 20%. And it's interesting because you say, if lab grown meat tastes the same and costs the same, would you switch over a substantial portion of your consumption? And the people who say no, the top 2 reasons that they say no are they think it's going to not taste very good, and they explain how it's going to be, mushy or whatever, and they think it's going to cost too much. So they literally just like deny the premise of the question.
That shows you how deep those instincts are, though, right? Like, people have trouble imagining it genuinely tasting the same,
Exactly,
or genuinely costing the same.
I think once we have hit price and taste parity, whoever the people are who are going to be the holdouts, and there will be some, I think a lot of that will melt away when they see other people consuming it enthusiastically. And then the benefits kick in. The fact that it's not going to be contaminated with antibiotics, the fact that bacterial contamination rates are going to be astronomically lower. So if it's price competitive, taste competitive, you're literally like, for salmon, you're going to be paying a premium to have the mercury and the dioxins in the fish. It feels unlikely that a lot of people are going to continue to do that. What I do think is that you're going to have the people, the sort of Alice Waterses and the Michael Pollans and the people like that.
This is something I wanted to ask too. Like, what is because right now you're seeing it out there, this sort of Maha movement, this sort of, it's kind of a bipartisan grassroots, I would say social reaction against the notion of sort of fakeness and artificiality. There's and there's a lot of scientific nonsense, as floating around in that world. But I wonder, like, do you view that as a serious threat? This notion that we want something natural and there's just something unnatural about this. And that's kind of like, you can't argue someone out of that. It's not really a scientific judgment. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a feeling. I just wonder, like, has the Maha movement yet aligned against this? Do you think it's going to? Do you worry about that sentiment?
I think you hit on it when you said, to the degree that it is not rational, and I think a lot of it is not rational, then I think that would be a very real worry and concern. But I'm not sure that, until the products compete on price and taste, they were not going to take off anyway. So the question would be, is Maha going to be able to hurt scientific or innovation or government support? Not in most of the world. And interestingly, we just saw a overwhelmingly bipartisan vote in favor of science. NIH's budget went up, the Department of Energy's budget went up, NIST's budget went up, the National Science Foundation, their budget went down from, I think, like $8.8 to $8.75 billion. But bipartisan support for science seems to be really alive and well. So even in the US, I remain cautiously optimistic about the government support that we've seen for alternative proteins continuing, especially when you factor in the Chinese competition element. Republicans and Democrats are enthusiastic about alternative proteins. Even Donald Trump, the first significant grant for cultivated meat R&D since 2005 was the National Science Foundation, $3.55 million to UC Davis to set up a cultivated meat consortium. And under the Trump administration, we've seen 3 companies get regulatory approval, which is more than 4 years under Joe Biden. So I do think Republican concern about things like food self-sufficiency, about economic competitiveness, about keeping pace with China. And then you've got the Bipartisan Commission on Biotechnology, which is inclusive of alternative proteins. So, knock on wood, it seems like things are going well.
A bunch of research came out a few years ago. I should have this at my fingertips since we're talking about it, but I'm sure you're familiar. A big research paper came out a few years ago basically saying the cultivated meat industry is going nowhere. It's probably not going to go anywhere. It was a big story for a while. I don't know how that played out. What if that paper and that research was wrong? What was it wrong about? And the reason I'm asking this is because my vague memory is that one of the reasons they were skeptical is the extraordinarily high energy input needs of this industry. So A, what happened to all that research? And B, is that right? What are the energy input considerations here?
So let me just say on the MAGA thing quickly, the plant-based meat products have lower energy density and more protein, which is one of the key factors that sort of the MAGA health movement is concerned about.
Oh, yeah. They do love protein.
Yes. And so whatever else you want to think about the protein craze, the plant-based meats, the 8 of them that are closest in taste to the animal-based meats, so not the jackfruit products or the wheat products or tempeh or whatever, but the Impossible products predominantly. So the Impossible hot dog, the Impossible and Beyond burgers, the Impossible nuggets. The Impossible hot dog has 3 times the protein of a beef hot dog. So I do think we have a very strong story to tell on the plant-based side. And then on the cultivated side, people right now eat meat despite how it's produced, not because of how it's produced. When you start having a conversation about the fact that USDA and FDA have 100 different chemicals, including things like amoxicillin and penicillin and ractopamine and ivermectin, where there are acceptable levels of contamination in meat. I think they call it like generally, no, they don't call it generally recognized as safe, but that's basically what it means. I mean, I think when you have the opportunity to have a conversation about current meat production practices and then say, what cultivated meat is just pure meat and far safer, that feels like a pretty easy conversation to have to the degree that you're having a conversation based in rationality.
Yeah, but are you ever? I mean, this is part of what I've been doing these last 3 days is trying to sort of anticipate like what crazy, you can never really anticipate in advance, but like the idea that we're just going to have a rational conversation and rationally transition. I'm somewhat skeptical about that given the experience of the last 10 to 20 years. I've just sort of been wondering like what craziness could spring up around this and like who knows?
I could tell stories about enthusiasm in places like Singapore, Japan, Korea, China, Israel. I do think there's going to be a degree to which the US is not going to want to be left behind. And there's enthusiasm here too. I mean, there's really impressive stuff happening at North Carolina State. There's a Bezos Center for Sustainable Proteins. So Jeff Bezos gave $30 million to 3 universities through the Bezos Earth Fund, also included alternative proteins in their $100 million AI challenge for nature and climate. So $8 million to AI endeavors focused on alternative proteins from the Bezos Earth Fund. And then UC Davis has a center that's doing some really great work. And then Tufts.
Before we leave it behind, let's talk about the energy input. Am I misremembering that? Maybe it was vertical farms I'm thinking about, but like as I vaguely recall, I thought that the amount of energy input required is a problem here. Is that an issue with cultivated meat?
I mean, when you crunch the climate numbers, you still end up, even with the energy needs, obviously you have far less land required, but for cultivated meat,
Sure.
You do end up with high energy needs, but it's very much a part of electrify everything.
Sure. But I was just saying that this will be another, I mean, when we're talking about electrifying everything, this will be another giant new source of electricity demand if we transition at scale.
So when scientists looked at a pilot plant that was producing like 10 million metric tons, I think, per year, which is relatively small. I think the average slaughterhouse produces 30, 35. The energy use needs were high. Most of that was for cooling, and the jury is very much out on whether those like something like 80% of it was for cooling. And the jury's out on whether that's even going to be necessary. But I remember the IEA. I mean, the IEA projections about electrifying transport indicate that obviously a shift to electric vehicles is going to require an awful lot of energy. And it's a reasonable trade-off because you get rid of gas. Here you're looking at things like, humanity's number one source of methane, which over 20 years is 80 times as potent as carbon dioxide. And the number one source is ruminant digestion. All of agriculture, it's over 50%. And then similarly, nitrous oxide, 274 times as potent as carbon dioxide. And you slash that with a shift to alternative proteins. So
Sure.
You can decarbonize energy.
I'm in no way arguing against
Yeah.
it. Like if you're going to trade off all that pollution for renewable energy demand, obviously that's a great trade, but it's still just worth noting.
Sure.
We're going to need a lot of renewable energy to run this.
That is true. And then there's also the land use benefits. So the alternative is no forests, savannas, no wild spaces at all, because everything needs to be taken over by agriculture with all of the massive increases in methane and nitrous oxide that come with that. So it definitely is going to profit from energy transition. But as I think I heard you say, you can get to abundant energy. You can't get to abundant land. The amount of land that's available is going to be, it is what it is.
Yeah. I just never miss an opportunity to say, no matter what you think about data centers, we need a lot more renewable energy.
Yes.
in coming years, no matter what. Like pick your industry. And this is just another one. This is just another one where if you want to make it clean, you need a boatload of renewable energy, basically. Like same for cars, same for almost anything. Like you're substituting renewable energy for the dirty outputs, but like that just means you need a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, plant-based meat uses a lot less energy than producing animal meat because it doesn't have the same cooling needs for cell growth. So plant-based, if you need fewer factories and you're producing far fewer inputs, that's going to be less energy needs overall. But cultivated meat energy needs, assuming that we do have the cooling needs for the production process, is going to be very high energy needs. But at a trade-off of getting rid of what the climate community has thought for a really long time was, it's called the hard to abate sector. What do we do about all that methane? What do we do about all that nitrous oxide?
It turns out the answer to every hard to abate sector is just throw a boatload of cheap renewable energy at it and you can solve it. But that requires boatloads of renewable energy. Okay, so as a final thing, next policy steps. It seems like you could address a lot of the current shortcomings of plant-based meats by just mixing in a little real meat.
Oh, yeah.
Selling blends, basically. This is something I think is intuitive to a lot of people. Like, why isn't there more of that? Why can't I buy sort of like a pound of ground beef that's only, in reality, a half a pound of ground beef and a half a pound of like plant simulation? Like, why isn't that already on the market? And am I right in saying that would be a sensible kind of first step to take?
Yeah, and one of the really great things about that is if you're blending in mycoprotein or plant protein, you actually have a product that is higher in protein, lower in fat and saturated fat, higher in fiber, lower in cholesterol. So it's a healthier product.
A healthier meat.
Yeah, exactly.
You're selling meat that's healthier than the other meat.
Yeah, and you can probably get to price and taste parity maybe right away.
So why is no one doing that?
I think it is that they are gun shy from previous efforts where basically filler, less expensive, less healthy ingredients were shoved into ground beef at, for example, I think Taco Bell. I think there was something like this maybe at Subway. There was the green slime CBS expose.
Yeah.
So, I mean, our pitch to industry is lean in on the health benefits. Like, don't claim that it's, really it was consumers felt duped because consumers were duped. And I do think we need to be careful on the blends and really need to lean in on the deliciousness and lean in on the health benefits in a way that nobody can, claim that this is being hidden from them. But yes, I mean, in the book, I'm very enthusiastic about the idea of blends. And I think it's a massive opportunity waiting to be picked up.
If I'm just an ordinary person and I'm gripped by the merits of this, meat is having all these awful effects, environmental, social, health. We have now science at hand where we could plausibly substitute products that have just as good taste and texture and umami and satisfaction, and they could thereby avoid all these damages of meat. Someone is gripped by this. What should they do? What should they advocate for? What are the sort of policies? In the short term, is it all just science and research, or is there some other policy lever that you also think is worth pulling?
I mean, one of the things that I find surprising is just how little analysis has been done of this as an intervention. So we've got the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, their Nature Communications piece, but there are overwhelming numbers of climate and environmental scientists, climate and environmental science departments, think tanks for environment and climate, and so too, global health, hunger and development. And there have probably been 10 analyses of alternative proteins, and I would guess there have been 100 plus of CDR every year. And, UNEP releases their report about how we're going backward on climate. They've repeatedly talked about CDR. They're talking about clean hydrogen. They're talking about biofuels.
God, and there's all this carbon to squeeze out so easily here.
Exactly.
I think people are gun shy about the meat. I just think culturally, people are nervous about it. People have very strong feelings about this.
I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of imagination that I talk about in chapter 8. People simply can't wrap their minds around the idea that something that doesn't exist now can exist in the future. It's the same reason that people thought that the dot-com bubble was going to be the end state of interstate commerce and so many other revolutions. In 1985, the CEO of Apple says home computers are never going to be more than they're never going to have a use case in the home other than a sort of a glorified bookkeeping or something like that. And there's not going to be much of a market for them. They're just endless examples of people not believing that a problem can be solved and of thinking that whatever the downsides are of something now, they're always going to be the downsides of that thing. So, I mean, the main thing is we need a lot more people working on this. And it's the sorts of people who are listening to your podcast. We need a lot more reports. We need a lot more analysis. We need a lot more thinking. And then, yeah, we also need a lot more science.
When do you think, if you had to put a number on it, I will be able to order a lab-grown hamburger that I will eat and not be able to tell it apart from a regular hamburger just at like a local restaurant? Like, how far away is that?
Yeah, I mean, that is chapter 11 of the book. Although in the intro, I point out that every meat sciences and agriculture department at a university on the planet has a meat lab, and 100% of what they're doing is conventional meat. So this is going to be meat in factories. And in the same way that every processed food starts in a food lab, but we don't call it lab produced cornflakes or whatever. So
lab-grown cornflakes.
Yeah, I mean, we say cultivated meat. Some people say cultured meat, although that sometimes gets people confused because they think it's like packed in salt or something. We say cultivated meat, but I do think lab-grown meat is a misnomer. But to answer your question, it really is going to be a function of how much we can create the science that gets us there. One scenario that I would love to see come to fruition is, Microsoft and Google are doing some amazing things with AI and therapeutics. Either of those companies, if they started really going all in on plant-based or cultivated meat, could get us there pretty quickly. I do think China could get us there pretty quickly. Even Korea. I mean, I was in Korea like 6 months ago, and they're really leaning in on food tech, and they're calling it food tech for the world.
Interesting.
The head of AI in Korea was saying, the US and China are going to be the global leaders on AI, but Korea is going to be the global leader on food tech focused AI. So I don't know what the answer is, but it really is going to be a function of people bringing the same level of seriousness and focus to this as a critical intervention that they're bringing to other solutions. So the more people we get actually working on this and taking it seriously, it's just insanely neglected relative to the impact that it could have. So that's sort of the pitch for your listeners is you can be one more person looking at clean hydrogen or whatever else, or you can actually be a massive unit of impact in this space.
Well said. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. This is amazing. Congrats on the book.
Thank you so much, David. People can check out the book at meatbook.org. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.